Thank you for joining us this afternoon for a discussion of ensuring equal pay every day. My name is Kate Nielsen, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy, Legal Advocacy, and Research for AAUW. Today, I'm joined by several colleagues: Lauren Homiser, Research Associate, Mia Smith, Director of Programs, and a few other staff members behind the scenes helping out. We'll also be welcoming three fabulous panelists to share their perspectives and help guide our discussion. We'll meet them in a few minutes. As I'm sure you are all well aware through the news and your own lived experiences, right now Americans are struggling to deal with the dual economic and health crises. And as new variants of COVID rage, we are left with more questions and uncertainty. Striving for economic stability in an unstable time is critical to the well-being of women and their families. AAUW is undertaking an ambitious initiative to determine what underserved women in New York City need to both survive and thrive in this difficult time. We're building on existing strands of work to bring forward concrete recommendations for policy and practice. AAUW is a leader on closing the gender pay gap. Annually, we publish the seminal The Simple Truth About the Gender Pay Gap report. We host free workshops across the country and online to empower women to negotiate a fair paycheck. We lead the Paycheck Fairness Act Coalition, and we engage our 170,000 members and supporters to enact policy change at the federal, state, and local levels. We know that we can't shrink the gender pay gap without addressing the ways in which the pandemic is exacerbating inequality. So during the summer of 2021, we published Pandemic Inequality, Latinas and the COVID-19 Experience, and we just conducted a survey of New York City women to understand and assess their needs during recovery. All of these initiatives help paint a picture of real-world experiences and guide our responses. To complement these work streams, we think it's imperative to bring the workforce together into conversation. By creating spaces for employers, managers, and employees to come together, we can jointly forge a path and determine new policies that will work for everyone. So that's what today is, the first in a series of conversations to try to understand and get comfortable with these issues around pay inequality. After the panel discussion, we'll hold two more, one featuring managers and another tapping leaders to discuss equal pay issues from their perspectives. We'll culminate this series by bringing all the groups together to help forge trust and reveal best practices for moving forward. To get us going today, I'd like to level set a little bit with general information about the gender pay gap from the most recent update to our Simple Truth About the Gender Pay Gap report. From there, I'll turn it over to Lauren to discuss the very preliminary, hot off the presses findings from a survey that we just conducted on economic security of New York City women during COVID. And then we'll get to the meat of the presentation, with Mia leading a conversation about what this all looks like in real world terms for real women. And finally, we'll conclude with some Q&A. So over a half century after pay discrimination became illegal in the United States, a persistent pay gap between men and women continues to hurt our nation's workers and our national economy. Women working full-time in the US are still paid just 83 cents to every dollar earned by men. And the consequences of this gap affect women throughout their lives. The pay gap makes it harder for women to repay student debt, and it even follows women into retirement. As a result of lower lifetime earnings, they receive less Social Security and pensions. The COVID-19 pandemic has not spared women or helped the gender pay gap. In fact, the effects on women and their economic security were immediately apparent. That being said, the data available to analyze the impact of the pandemic is a little bit dodgy. We usually rely on two different surveys to help us understand pay. But this year, only one set of data was released, and even that set was more limited than usual. Add to that the fact that it measures the pay of those in the workforce, and is not inclusive of those who dropped out or were forced out, and the story is confusing and complicated. While median earnings rose for both men and women working full-time in 2020, Median household income fell by 2.9% as millions of people lost their jobs. Overall, the share of men working full-time year-round fell, and in 2020, about a 6.1 percentage point change. But during that same period, the share of women working full-time year-round fell by about a 4.7 percentage point change. Since the low-wage working women were the most likely to lose their jobs, and keep in mind, women make up about 2/3 of the low-wage workforce overall, removing them from the calculation kind of artificially inflates the earning ratio, and it makes it seem like the pay gap closed faster than it likely did. In a very real sense, the bottom literally dropped out. And the reality is that the COVID-19 pandemic left women far worse off. As the data in years past shows, the gender pay gap does not affect all women equally. Most women of color earn substantially less than white non-Hispanic men, as well as men of their same race or ethnicity. But in addition to the variation in the pay gap among races, the past year also brought about uneven job loss, which will impact the racial pay gaps for years to come. Between 2019 and 2020, workers of all races and genders lost jobs, but not equally. Asian and Hispanic women were the hardest hit. The share of Asian women working full-time declined by 6.5 percentage points. Hispanic women experienced the greatest losses, a 6.9 percentage point drop. While striking, these numbers only begin to scratch the surface of telling the story of the economic impact of COVID. But no matter how you slice and dice the numbers, it adds up to lower pay and more economic insecurity for women. I'm going to hand it over to Lauren now to discuss the particular findings in the New York City metro region.
Thanks, Kate. So I want to talk a bit about the survey that AAUW ran in partnership with Ipsos at the end of August and the beginning of September. So we surveyed 723 women in a sample that was representative of the target population of women 18 and older living in New York City. And so as you can see, the women we surveyed were racially diverse, just like women in New York City. About 20% live with children under the age of 12. The median age was 50. 56% made $50,000 a year or less as their household income. And a little over half were working part or full time, which is representative of national labor force participation for women. Next slide, please. So one key finding that we're coming up with as we start sifting through the data is the really stunning level of economic insecurity that women in New York City face. As you can see here, over a third of women report that their income is not sufficient to provide for all their basic necessities. So that means that over a third of women in New York City are making some sort of choice between food, shelter, medical care, childcare if they have children. And so that's obviously pretty unacceptable. But even if women are able to meet their basic needs, more than half, as we can see by the various metrics here, feel financially insecure. About 58% say that their income isn't sufficient to secure the lifestyle that they want to live. 53% don't feel comfortable when they think about their financial situation. 53% don't feel financially secure. And 38% of women lost some or all of their income during the pandemic. And so some of this might be due to the pandemic, but that 38% doesn't account for these, majorities of women who don't feel financially secure. So this tells us that the pandemic is probably a factor, but the pandemic is not the only factor, that there are structural problems here that existed before the pandemic that were causing women to struggle with economic insecurity. And so, tying this into what we're talking about today, what would equal pay mean for these women? Next slide, please. So another thing that kind of became clear when looking at this is that the pandemic has made it significantly harder for working women with families to get by. Women are the first port of call for childcare because of social norms and expectations and the way our society works. And that is likely to have downstream effects on the gender pay gap. So we can see here that the dark blue bars are women and the lighter blue bars are their spouse or partner. The survey collected data primarily, the respondents were primarily, overwhelmingly, straight women. And so it's safe to say that women, as opposed to men, ended up taking more unpaid leave, quitting their job, or cutting back on hours at their job to manage childcare due to school closures and childcare center closures. And, the pandemic isn't even over. We don't know how this is going to play out long term. But if this many women had to cut back on work as opposed to men, it seems like this will likely exacerbate the gender pay gap downstream. Next slide, please. So the last point I want to make that is coming up in the survey data is that student debt repayment is both a cause and an effect of economic insecurity. It's a cause in as much as it adds another burden for women to carry. 18% of the women we surveyed carried student loan debt, and the median debt carried was about $17,500. And so 18% of women are making these payments every month. And that is another burden on top of childcare if they have children, food, housing, medical care. But then it's also an effect of economic insecurity because living closer to the margin means that when there's a crisis, it's harder to make those debt payments. So due to the pandemic, 36% of these women who had debt had to adjust the amount that they paid every year or every month. 46% had to pause repayment and 22% had to apply for student financing. So all of this tells us that unequal pay is having a profound effect on women's month-to-month economic realities. I hope that frames the conversation for you, Kate. I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. And we can go to the next slide. I really appreciate the context that Lauren was able to provide that's particular to New York City. So we've gone from general pay gap to New York City and COVID, and now I want to leave you with a little bit about the folks who are on the phone right now and what you all think about pay inequality before we turn it over to the panel to really get to the meat of our discussion. So thank you to those who took our participant survey. It was really interesting and enlightening to collect and understand your perspectives of those who have joined us today. I think it provides some really nice context to what you all think about these issues and your own perspectives. And it'll both give you a sense of what other people on this webinar think and also help our panelists a bit think about who they're talking to. So in answer to this first question, what steps could your employer take to improve your work-life balance? The most common responses were allow you flexibility in when you start or end your workday and offer more time off for vacation, sick days, and personal time. Other very popular answers were allow you to work 4 longer days per week instead of 5 regular days and offer more time off for family leave. For those who decided to write in another option, several people wanted to see fully remote or hybrid environments. And I think my personal favorite comment was this one: not contact employees during time of leave and hire staff that can backstop completely when people are out of the office. This is critically important, I think, both to workflow as well as to mental health in terms of really being able to step away from work for a few hours, days, or weeks, whatever the case may be. And as a segue to the next question, there was one comment about routinely evaluating pay and performance, and a few others that stated that their employers already offered many of these options, but at the cost of lower pay. Now, when it comes to individual steps to reducing pay inequality, that second question, I want to be clear and emphasize here that pay inequality is a systemic problem. It's not something to be laid on the shoulders of workers, but it is an area where you may be able to empower yourself to help make your own situation better. So happily, according to the survey, over half of you are comfortable taking various steps to address the issue. Nearly 3/4 of you feel comfortable negotiating your salary when starting a new job. Almost 2/3 of you would negotiate a promotion or raise once you're in a job. And just over half of you would both discuss your salary with coworkers and ask your employer to publish salary ranges. These are all really important ways to push for pay equality. Finally, on that last question about barriers to equal pay in your own workplace, the most common answers were around race, ethnicity, and other entrenched biases that are still hanging on and posing lots of problems. There's also a lot of comments about the lack of transparency and no enforcement mechanisms to correct for pay inequality. Finally, additionally, there were comments about shortcomings in the recruitment and hiring process, which includes reliance on salary history. And I think that's a really important bucket. That's something that a lot of our advocacy focuses on to try and get good laws in place around that. And will certainly be a topic of discussion in further panels with managers and leaders in this field. And finally, a few different people noted occupational segregation, which is absolutely critical in terms of how women are also often steered into different positions. And then women's work, or what is thought of as traditional women's work, is often undervalued and underpaid. My favorite way to sort of think about occupational segregation is that on average, men are paid to watch cars as valets more than women are paid to watch children. I think that's pretty enlightening and extremely disappointing in how our systems value the work of different people. All right, panel. I think that gives you a good sense of what other folks on the call today are thinking about structurally and in their own individual lives. I'm happy to return to questions about this participant survey at the end in the Q&A. Thank you for those who did fill out the survey. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Mia to get this conversation rolling. And a big thank you to our panelists for participating in this important conversation.
Thanks, Kate and Lauren, for that powerful information. And I think the one word that came to mind when I was looking at all the data is just resilience. So my name is Mia Smith again, and I'm the Director of Programs here at the American Association of University Women, or AAUW. We're really excited that you joined us for this lunchtime hour of power with the goal of breaking the silence and inspiring women to share their stories in hope of encouraging other women. And we know that there is strength in numbers. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Today's roundtable, Ensuring Equal Pay Every Day, Employee Edition, is just part one of a three-part series on a continued journey of pay equity for all. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge September 15th through October 15th is Hispanic Heritage Month. And then I would personally like to pay homage to some Hispanic American women who really changed my life and pushed me in my trajectory of my personal career. The first one is Dolores Fernandez Huerta, who is 91 years young. She's a labor leader, civil rights activist, and a co-founder of the National Farm Workers Association. Also, Linda Chavez Thompson comes to mind. She's a former boss of mine, and she is the former executive vice president of the National AFL-CIO, or the American Federation of Labor, Congress, and Industrial Organization, who advocates for women and families. And last, but certainly not least, would be the Honorable Sonia Sotomayor, who is the first woman of color, the first Hispanic and first Latin American sister to serve on the Supreme Court. So while we are not there yet, there's no denying that we have made progress. And our goal is to continue to have these roundtables and conversations with women to stay on that same trajectory of progress. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our phenomenal panelists. So our first panelist is Angela DeGeorge. She is a 2017-2018 selected professional fellow of AAUW, and she currently works as an architectural designer in New York City. Next, we have Helen S. Jarrett. She is a mobilization coordinator, which is her day job, but she's also a CWA, or the Communication Workers of America Local 1180 Executive Board member. And finally, we have Rosie Roman. She's an administrative manager for the city of New York, and she too is also a member of CWA Local 1180. Thank you, ladies, for joining us. So for participants, I'm just going to ask our panelists some questions, and they will respond accordingly, sharing with us their stories. And we're going to try and have, just a general, a sort of organic conversation and hear their testimonies. So I'm going to kick it off with Angela. And Angela, the first question is this: equal pay for equal worth is both the law of the land and widely popular concept, yet not a reality for much of the workforce, as we just saw. So what do you think, or why do you think this is, and what makes it hard to talk about, not to mention achieve?
Yeah, thanks. So there's so many reasons why this is. I think the data that Kate and Lauren just presented shows the severity of the issue, and mainly it's a side effect, right, of gender inequality is unequal pay. And it's a systemic issue, like Kate touched on. And I think there's a lot of high-level systemic reasons of why pay inequity happens, but I wanted to share some of the more individual low-key things that I've noticed, and maybe they have greater impacts across the nation. And one of those things is laziness by business owners. I think any business owner, even if they're well-intentioned, take an opportunity to save money. So it's just like laziness. Like, I have heard of stories of women negotiating their salaries higher just by mentioning that they know of a situation of pay inequity inside the company. And it's like they already know it's happening, but they're too lazy to correct it, or they think they're getting away with something. So as soon as it's mentioned, I find business owners do correct it. So yeah, and then another reason is imposter syndrome. This is a big one for me because as a female designer, well, architecture is a pretty male-dominated field, but I've found incredible support amongst women's groups in New York City, but women tend to have much more imposter syndrome than men, and less confidence asking for a fair salary going into especially their first job out of school. So, and I see it even in my peers now when we're some years into our career, and when it's time to have an annual review, we all call up each other and we try to, support each other, and everyone has this feelings of anxiety and nervousness for asking for more money, even though I know that they are so talented and so worth it and so valuable to their companies. So I chalk that up to imposter syndrome for sure. Yeah.
But Angela, the one thing I definitely want to highlight is the fact that you and your colleagues have found strength in numbers, and the fact you guys feel comfortable talking with each other and acknowledging and leaning on one another. I think that's so powerful to share, because while we know some of these greater bias exists, you guys are still saying, while they exist, that we are going to empower ourselves. We're going to have this conversation, so we sort of serve as support systems, inspiring and encouraging each other to ask for what we deserve. So thank you for sharing, because I think that that is really powerful, that the conversations are happening. They may not be happening as much as we want them to, but they are happening.
Yeah.
Helen and Rosie, do you guys have anything to add to what Angela shared?
First, I would like to say, Mia, Lauren, and Kate, thank you so very much, and AAUW for having me today. I agree with Angela. It is difficult and more nerve-wracking for a woman to put herself out there and ask for a salary raise than it is for a man. He can just walk in the room and ask for it and more than likely get it, but we have to prepare and we have to go through so many things emotionally to build ourselves up to ask that question.
Thanks, Helen. Rosie, do you have anything to add?
I think I also agree. I think there's a perceived safety in silence, and we don't really speak up. I think for me personally, that was my experience. I wasn't even aware of what was going on. And had it not been for the union, I don't know that I would have had the courage to speak up for myself. So it's very brave and courageous that people are having these conversations with their employers. So yeah, I definitely agree.
That's powerful. There's perceived safety in silence. That was really a powerful statement. But you still found a way to feel inspired and encouraged through your support system, and that is through your union, your local union. And I think everybody has to find their own way, but the goal is definitely to find a support system, right? And I think that's what we're all talking about. Just how do you find the courage and how do you find your little tribe? You know, we all talk about, we have our little group, our girlfriends, but who is your tribe that is challenging you to go further? And I think that that's important for us to figure out that support system. All right, I'm going to go on to the next question. Helen, I'm going to kick this one off to you. So have you ever experienced or known about pay inequity in your career or workplace? And if so, what did you do? And if you could go back in time, would you change your course of action?
I did at one point experience inequality at work. And we, as a group of diverse women, there were 5 of us, our titles were indicative to our agencies. We saw that as we were working, we were getting more and more responsibilities placed on us. Someone got the idea, let's band together and let's go in and let's have a discussion. And we did. It was a very robust conversation. But what I can recall so far as the best thing that I could walk away with was that the boss said to us at the time that he was so appreciative that we came in and we approached him first rather than going to the union. But at the time, they didn't know that I was already heavily involved in the union. So if it was supposed to go south, it would have been a challenge. However, if it is something that I would do again, going back in time, absolutely, because that emboldened me for the future, what we went through as administrative managers in CWA Local 1180.
Thank you, Helen. Wow, that word embolden is powerful. And it is really important. Again, another example of how women, how we sit around and have conversations and basically say, wait, that happened to me too. Oh, wait, that happened to me too. And I think the other part is knowing that all managers are not necessarily the enemy, right? The fact that you guys band together as the professionals that you are and had a conversation with your boss at the time, and he was open and appreciative of that conversation, I think speaks volumes of some employers. There are some good employers out here, right? And so it is important for us to acknowledge those best practices and try to promote and highlight it in hopes that others will follow suit. Angela, do you have anything to add to that question?
I just wanted to add a personal experience that I didn't talk about yet, is that I did lose my job during the pandemic. And for about 8 months, I transitioned to being a freelance designer. And I learned a lot that I would do differently next time. So that was a good experience. I like talking about fair pay. It was a challenge to learn how to be fair to myself, not in comparison to other employees, but what am I going to charge as my own fee? And that's a very like philosophical question of what's your worth. And like, I didn't like grappling with that question, but I had to do it. And I learned a lot what to do next time of, yeah, just the tools of bringing confidence to my clients about, you know, this is the service I give and this is why it's worth it. Cause I do think my job is hard and like but it's easy to go in front of a client and feel like you don't deserve what you're charging. Yeah. So that's something I've learned for the future.
Angela, that's really powerful. And one of the things we do in one of our AAUW trainings, Work Smart, is know your value. And I think that's exactly what you shared. Just being confident that you know your value and you're not going to settle for less. And that's important. Mm-hmm. Rosie, do you have anything to add as far as you having an experience that you knew about pay inequity?
No, but I agree with both Helen and Angela. I think for me, I can advocate for my clients. I will fight for whatever it is that I feel that they deserve. But I find it more difficult for me to speak up for myself. You know, I don't know if it's a card handed to me. You have to speak up. And thankfully, you know, my union has, like Helen said, emboldened me to be able to have the difficult conversations, to step forward out of my comfort level, to be able to say, I'm worth it. I bring a lot to the table and I do need to speak for myself. And most of the time, thankfully, I have the union supporting me, but sometimes I have to have these conversations on my own. But I have to push forward because I am worth it. And that's all.
No, that's right, Rosie.
That's how I feel.
You are worth it. And we have to become our own best advocate. And I think one thing I try to share with peers and colleagues is that you can't hold people accountable for what you don't tell them, right? And so it is accountability factor. And you the same way you advocate for your clients, you're learning to do that for yourself because you're worth it. So thank you for sharing that with us. And we're down to our last question, and I want to kick this question off to Rosie. So, have you heard about or personally experienced any success stories when it comes to reducing pay inequity? Do you have a success story you want to share with us?
Due to a collective action, my union undertook on behalf of all administrative managers who are mostly women of color. And that action resulted in a 25% pay increase for me. And, you know, it's been life-changing. I think, it's been really life-changing for me. It's benefited me in so many ways. So, and as well as other administrative managers. And it helps me realize the value of having the union support me and all of the administrative managers. So, yeah, it was a successful effort on the part of the union, and all of the administrative managers benefited from it. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, everyone, but you guys understand Zoom and the technical difficulties that sometimes happen. But I definitely don't want to miss, the power that collective action, the impact, the long-term impact of collective action. So, Helen, if you could just tell us real briefly how that 25% increase took place, that would be great.
Yes, absolutely. This was a lawsuit that over a span of 5 years that we had out there for women, women of color, and minorities. And we finally won our lawsuit. And it was a long process and journey that we had to go through. After the final decisions were made, what monies were divided amongst everyone, what happened is now individuals had to be put in levels, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And Rosie was fortunate enough to be labeled as a level 2. So that's what brought her increase up to 25%. I am also one of the fortunate recipients of this lawsuit over time that we had.
So how much overall was the lawsuit? What was the outcome? What was the overall number?
The overall number was 15 million for approximately 2,000 individuals who were a part of this collective lawsuit.
Wow. Oh, when collective action works, it works so well. Angela, do you have a story, anything else you might want to share, a personal experience, a success story, and how, reducing pay inequity took place, either you directly or one of your colleagues?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned it in the beginning, like how I have heard of even this example is a senior architect that I know that's a principal at a big architecture firm in New York City. And she found out that one of her male counterparts was making more than her and had different benefit, vacation time or whatever. And she kind of did that thing where she was like, oh, well, he has more kids than I do. And but she had been there for longer than him. And then, like I said, she just mentioned it and the company corrected it immediately. So it's like she kind of shamed them a little bit, or they probably felt shame immediately. And yeah, she was able to get her pay on a fair playing field with her counterpart.
Wow. This is inspiring. I think, and I will reiterate that while in no way, shape, or form are we there yet, I think when we can look at solutions and we can share best practices, it does inspire us to keep, to stay hopeful and to keep doing the work that we do so that we can ensure that we stay on the same trajectory of helping to close the pay gap in our own individual spaces. So employees are empowering themselves to be their own best advocate. We are making sure we take advantage of access to managers and those in leadership that can help make a difference. And we are building ourselves up to have the self-confidence to know that we are worth it. So I really want to thank each and every one of you for spending this hour with us, just to remind us that we need to know our value, right? That we need to become our own best advocate. And last but not least, that we are definitely worth it. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Kate to see what are some of our participants asking.
Yeah, thanks, Mia. And thank you to Angela, Helen, and Rosie. Really interesting and important conversation. Mia, I'm going to ask a couple questions sort of lumped together that I think you can speak directly to through your work with our salary negotiation trainings, but maybe the panelists can also weigh in on it as well. And those are around sort of how to do this. And so one question is around how much does what you do in terms of like your responsibilities matter versus your years of experience. And then similarly, a very similar question in terms of how to respond to an employer who bases promotions on tenure rather than equal or greater experience at another company.
Good questions. So first and foremost, I want participants to know that AAUW has a free resource for you to add to your toolkit. It's called Work Smart Online. You can go to salary.org and you can sign up for this training that is at no cost and is self-paced. And in this training, we sort of go over 4 key parts, one of which is know your value and then knowing your strategy. And so for the question directly about market rate, if you will, I think part of what we need to do is go into these meetings empowered, right? Because it really doesn't matter what you made at your last job, because the employer has already made up their mind what the salary or salary range is going to be for that particular position. So I think as women, one, we want to be armed with facts and know that there is a market value for that position, and you want to be mindful of what that market value is, so you don't want to sell yourself short, number one. The second thing is experience does matter, right? And so there's typically a range for a salary range. So if you know, say there's the salary range is from 70 to 80 to 80,000, you need to put together your value statements, right? And a value statement is for you to be able to say, what skill set do I have? How have I made an impact? And what were those results? So I think we have to get comfortable with bragging about ourselves a little bit. I know people don't normally do important. And our male counterparts have no problem saying how they changed the world, right? And so I think we have to get comfortable with being able to write down. So one of the things that I do, I'm getting older. I can't remember what I did yesterday. So it's important to keep a journal of your little value statements or things that you've accomplished throughout the year. Don't wait till evaluation time. We keep our cell phones on us on a regular basis. Use that note section in your cell phone and write down those little small successes. The other thing is we also want to be mindful of organizational culture. Those things matter too. So it's not always I saved the organization $20,000, but if you have an energy that you bring to the organization that shift the organizational culture, that's important too. Typically, women are the ones who remember people's birthdays, that celebrate. We spend a lot of time at work. So it's great when you can go into an environment that you enjoy. So those are just a couple of things that you can do in knowing your value, knowing what the market rate is, and being comfortable with selling yourself based on facts. And by taking Work Smart online, you can feel confident that you've put your ducks in a row, if you will. So when you go in to have that conversation, you'll be comfortable. And the other thing is we want to be mindful that this is business. So people are always going to try to save a dollar where they can, right? And so the conversation does not need to be combative. Know that it's a conversation. And then, be prepared to answer those deflective questions like, well, we don't have money, or, well, it's just we're coming out of a pandemic. Yeah, all that may be true, but you guys highlighted in the survey that it may not be monetary. It may be that you want to negotiate for some flex time. So be open when you go into that conversation, knowing, is it simply monetary? Would I like to have some different benefits? What is my middle ground and what is my walk away point? So take all of that into consideration, because your benefits as well as the monetary piece all contribute to a work-life balance. Kate?
Thanks, Mia.
Does anybody else on the call have something to add? Any of our panelists? Do you have something to add to that?
Let me ask another question, and the panelists can piggyback on both of them, because it kind of plays on sort of advice and how to handle these things. Super useful, Mia. One of our participants just asked how to tactfully ask friends and colleagues how much they make. They say she doesn't know what her peers make, so doesn't know if she's being paid fairly, which is so important. So I don't know if Angela, Helen, or Rosie has a good response to that, or to piggyback on what Mia was talking about. But it's absolutely critical to be able to start to try and get comfortable with these uncomfortable conversations.
That's a great question, and I've thought about this because I have some close peers that we have no problem sharing our salaries together. And then there's some of my best friends that I just know that they are a bit more reserved about this topic. But I've come up with a little like a statement up front to ask it, and it's, you know, something along, you have to approach it in your style, but it's something along the lines of like, in the spirit of gender equality, in the spirit of fair pay and transparency, would you be comfortable sharing what your salary is with me? Because I'd like to know if it's fair to you or fair to me, and do you know what other people are making as well? You know, something like that, you know, all in the spirit.
That's powerful, Angela. Anybody else?
I would like to say that I like Angela's open-ended question and the way that she led in with those questions. That's very powerful. But with myself, 40 years of experience in the city, and speaking about experience does matter, and that is true, but that's not true for all. I remember when I went on an interview, I believe that I answered all the questions. I did a great interview. And in the end, they wanted to just offer me 4%. I know for the most part, for agencies, a promotion minimum is 8%. That I would not be able to accept because that would not have done anything for me. It would have been a small step upward and forward, but it wasn't enough to make an impact where I would be where it would have benefited me the most.
And Helen, that's important, because when you go through our Work Smart training, it advises you to know your walk away point, right? So think about all those things on the front end. And I think, Angela, you made a powerful statement is, you know, you have to know your audience, right? And everybody is not at the same space. And so I think it is important to find one of our participants, find a confidant. You may not initially have a conversation of, girl, what do you make? You know, and you don't want to lead in that way. But I think as you begin to build relationships, you know, I have a personal story. In a former, one of my earlier positions, I was training and onboarding someone, and she and I had built a great rapport. And in that training, she just happened to mention her salary to me. And when she mentioned her salary, you know, at that time I didn't have a poker face, so she could see it all over my face, right? And she was like, "Did I say something wrong?" And I said, "Well, actually, you didn't, but I'm training you, and you make $10,000 more than me." And I was so upset. I was a bag of emotions, right? So I walked out, and I asked her if I could, you know, follow up with her later. And then I immediately went right into my boss's office, and my boss and I had a good rapport. I wasn't a seasoned professional. I was a new professional. And I said to her, "How does it happen?" Right? And the first thing she did was ask me to sit down and calm down. And the first question she asked me was, "What did you negotiate for?" And I had mud on my face because I was recently out of college. What they offered me was more money than I had ever saw. So I jumped at the first thing. I didn't negotiate. So that was my first experience with learning how to be your own best advocate, because if people can get you cheaper, they will. But you also have to know your value going in. But I can proudly say that that never happened again. It was a hard lesson, but it was one that was learned. Kate, anything else?
Yeah, I'm going to take a personal point of privilege and answer one of these questions myself. It's in my wheelhouse, on the policy side of things. Question about if we need legislation around pay transparency. The answer is yes, absolutely yes. Many states have provisions around pay transparency, many do not. And we do not at the federal level. That language around pay transparency is included in several of the bills that we advocate for, and is certainly something that I think you should go to your local or state legislators and talk to about. I think, as you can tell from this conversation, we all feel really strongly that having open, transparent conversations is key. We know that folks in unions tend to have higher salaries and the lower wage gap, We also know that those who work in the public sector tend to have a lower pay gap. And I think a large part of that is due to transparency and people being able to see and understand what's going on. So there's a few different federal bills that we advocate for. One is the Paycheck Fairness Act. One is pay equity for all. And those bills include various provisions around salary transparency, some protecting workers to be able to speak openly about their salary. It's important to keep in mind that doesn't mean you get to gossip about everybody's, but you can talk about your own, right? And feel free to share your information and empower others. And I think another really key part of that is salary ranges and job postings, right? We need to make sure that each job is pegged with what it should be paid for that job. And if we have clear salary ranges that apply to a different job, I think it's easier for employees and employers to match with one another, so that they get the type of worker that they want and need in that role, and that worker is paid fairly. So again, transparency around that is really critical. So that's my long way of saying, yes, we do need legislation around this.
That was awesome, Kate. I think maybe we can take one more question. Maybe we have like 2 or 3 minutes left.
All right, we have a few more in here. Let me see if I can kind of combine them into one in a way that is useful and informative. There have been a few questions, I don't know if any of you can speak to this, around pay increases based on bonuses as opposed to salary raises, which is nice for a one-time influx of cash, but doesn't add to your base and therefore doesn't compound over the future. Does anyone on the call have any experience with that or thoughts about it?
I have received a bonus before. So I work for, small business, and having a great relationship with my boss, I think he shares the surplus of income the company makes in the form of a bonus at the end of the year to even things out. So I find that to be a really good, rewarding benefit. But it's all about what is right for you, because if flex time is right for you, if bonus is right for you, if more paid vacation days is right for you, that's what you can, you can make your own negotiation based on the things you find most valuable.
That's a good answer, Angela, because it's not a one-stop shop. And when you work for a private industry, that is more common than not. Helen, did you have something to add?
I have never received a paid bonus. I have gotten the contractual raises from the union over my years of service. That's what I have.
Yeah, so here's a perfect example, sort of a sector, things that oftentimes are sort of sector specific, right? Public versus private sector. So our hour of power is almost over. But let's see, when you have wonderful conversations, see how quickly it goes. But I do want to, before I turn it back over to Kate, just thank you, ladies, for joining us for part 1 of our series, Ensuring Equity, or ensuring equal pay every day from an employee perspective. We are hopeful that we will continue this conversation. Our next sessions will be in both November and December. And in those sessions, we're going to talk with managers. And in the December session, we're going to talk to our CEOs and leaders with the goal of coming back all together and finding best practices and solutions to keep our trajectory of moving forward in the quest for equal pay. So stay connected with us. Please visit our website at aauw.org. Again, check out our website. We will have the dates for our November and December session that will focus on managers and leaders in the roundtable discussion. And again, I just want to thank Angela, Rosie, and Helen for giving up their lunch hour to empower us and share some of your great stories and experiences with the hope of empowering other women. And I will leave us with the final statement. It is words of wisdom from my Nana. And she would always say, when you know better, you do better. So let's all do our part in doing better. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.